Welcome back to another 5 Fact Friday, and also happy African American Heritage Month. Today, we are going to be diving into the influence that African Americans have had on the world of bourbon specifically, but also just whiskey in general, because rye whiskey is in this conversation as well. Now, before we dive in, there are two sides of this conversation that I do want to just address before we get into it. One side is going to say the world of African American influence isn't really anything new, so we don't really need to talk about it. And then the other side is saying that African Americans are really just starting to break into the world of bourbon in the last like 30, 40, 50 years, something like that. And this is really cool, and we need to talk about it. Both of them are kind of correct. The reason is, yes, there is a ton of really awesome heritage and history here, but it isn't all super well known. And yes, this is something new because it's now more in the public eye of what was going on. So with that said, let's dive into this. In classic whiskey or wine fashion, we are going to dive in at the very beginning and talking about basically bourbon at its conception. Starting with the whiskey knowledge. In the world of bourbon making, it is a very physically demanding job to really do anything. Whether you are growing the grains, moving them, grinding them up, cooking them, getting the fire to boil the water to cook them, letting it ferment, taking that and then distilling it, having a fire again to distill it, and then barreling it, moving it. This is all very physically demanding. So, of course, in the early days, during slavery times, you were going to use slave labor. And this doesn't mean that every single distillery owned slaves, things like that, but a lot of them did use slave labor, and the slaves were the one who were actually doing the distilling process and doing this work. And if they weren't directly doing it, they were still there watching it and maybe had one person over them. Due to this, it meant that these African Americans, these slaves, had a really good idea about the entire distilling process. And even if a distillery didn't own slaves, during their peak seasons, it was very common for them to get a slave or slaves rented to them so that they would be able to keep up with the demand during their peak season. One of the other extremely physically demanding things about making whiskey or making bourbon is having the barrels. Making a barrel is incredibly physically demanding. Again, if you've never been to a cooperage or watched a video on it, there's a ton of videos on YouTube here. Go check one out. It's really cool, but to watch someone take these staves and basically start burning them and bending them, you have to wet them so they don't burn, and making it so that it actually forms together, hammering the rings around it. It's a lot of work. So again, this was largely left up to the slaves. They were the ones who were building these barrels, coopering them, and they knew how to make good barrels. They knew how to make good bourbon. And again, remember, this wasn't, I want to make good bourbon because I want to make good bourbon. Not always, probably part of it. But this was, I need to do this so that I actually can live, because slave labor. So once this was all happening and slavery ended, there was this knowledge gap essentially between the people who wanted to have a distillery and the slaves who actually knew how to make a good product. So there's this knowledge passing. There's a reference of this happening one major time, which most people know about, but I'm assuming, and I'm a strong believer, that if this happened once, it likely happened in some other scenarios as well. The specific scenario that I'm talking about is with Jack Daniels and Nathan Green, aka Uncle Nearest. Uncle Nearest was an ex-slave, African-American, who's now free, and he went to Jack Daniels and was teaching him how to make whiskey, how to go about the entire distillation process, all these nitty-gritty details about how to make a good product. This really jump-started Jack Daniels' career and made it so he can make the product that we all know about today, and that the rest of the world, if you say, hey, bourbon, they'd be like, Jack Daniels? Most likely. Some people are still saying bourbon's not, or Jack Daniels is not bourbon, it's Tennessee whiskey. It's fine. The point here is this knowledge was passed on from an ex-slave, this African American, to Jack Daniels. This likely happened in some other areas because, again, they didn't know everything that was going on, and now that they didn't want to pay these African Americans this much money to go do everything, they had to figure it out themselves or have someone teach them. African Americans were still working at the distillery, usually just in those more manual jobs, so likely still with coopering, with moving around the grains, with shoveling coal to keep the fires burning, things like that. It wasn't until much later when some groundbreaking started to happen. So eventually, African Americans did start to get into the world of bourbon and whiskey a little bit more and started getting more high-profile jobs, whatever it may be. But there's one specific one I want to talk about because she's just awesome and her story is really cool, and I would love to just dedicate a video just to her because it's really awesome. But we are talking about Elmer Lucille Allen. She was a scientist, basically. She got her degree in chemistry, went to school, awesome, got out, tried to find a job, couldn't find a job because this is really, I believe it's like early, mid 1900s. So African-American woman finding a job super easily, not likely. Eventually, though, she does get a contact with someone, and they are able to help her get a job with Brown-Forman. And if you don't know, Brown-Forman is the parent company over Jack Daniel's, Woodford Reserve, and Old Forester. She gets a job with them as a junior analytical chemist. Awesome. She slowly works her way all the way up to be at the literal top. She was their senior analytical chemist. She was in charge of making sure that everything was good on a chemical level for the bourbons that they were producing. Incredibly nerdy, incredibly awesome. But she worked her way from the bottom all the way to the top and had a very awesome, groundbreaking moment in the world of bourbon for an African-American woman. Now, there are numerous more stories like this, and I don't have the time to get into all of these. There are people who were starting their own whiskey brands, people who were writing cocktail books or opening a bourbon bar, something like that, that opened the door to the African-American community more in the world of bourbon. One thing I do want to point out, though, is bourbon is an American heritage. I've stated this before when we were talking about bourbon heritage during Bourbon Heritage Month. But if it's an American thing, African-Americans, it's an African-American thing too. We have been involved with this really from the conception and are still involved with it, whether it's moving the product, making the product, writing about the product, teaching about the product, whatever it may be. And it's really cool to see, and I do think it is something to acknowledge, celebrate, and really just enjoy all the nerdy things that we can learn about this and from each other. So as always, I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys have a good rest of your week. Cheers.